Hi, I'm John Evans, and I'm here to do a book chat from Keystroke International. So we're going to try and do a series of these. We've been trying to do them in front of every show, but it's not always possible for us to get that done. Where we just have a quick talk about a book. Hasn't been quick so far, but a quick talk about a book that we've all read and hopefully enjoyed. I'm going to do a sequence of these to cover the first anthology that's by Keystroke Medium, and that's Kingdoms of Iron and Stone, and it's an anthology of 14 epic fantasy stories. So hopefully these will give you some idea of what the stories in the anthology are about, and this might be your introduction to some of these authors. So without further ado, the first story in the anthology is Unchosen by Rick Partlow. I'm going to try and keep off real spoilers for these, but if you're really spoiler averse, I would suggest just buy the anthology and read them, rather than listen to me try and talk about these without giving away anything that you might need, might need to not know before you read the book. So I really enjoyed Unchosen. I particularly enjoyed the way that Rick played into the tropes of the questing heroes, and they start out from an inn, which, if you're a role player, is a really familiar trope that we use in gaming in particular, but also you'll find it in all sorts of epic fantasy stories. You might find that there's a reason for that. If you look into the backgrounds of any of your favorite epic fantasy stories since the invention of role-playing as a proper gaming system, you'll find that most, if not all of them, are role players, and quite a few of the major ones actually were a role-playing game in some form before the author or authors committed them to the page. So yeah, I mean, I found it a very familiar story from the outset, and that's a very good thing. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, aren't tropes bad things? Doesn't that mean you're writing the same story over and over again? And well, you are. There aren't that many different types of story out there, and the tropes are there for a reason. Just because your story has recognizable tropes in it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. You'll often get people making outrageous claims about stories, such as, oh, stories have to be unique and they have to be completely original and they shouldn't contain anything, that's the same as other stories that have been told. It's one of the least helpful ways to teach people about writing that I've ever encountered, but I have heard it all over the place from English teachers and critics and people reviewing things in magazines and online and what have you. The idea that a story shouldn't repeat things that have been done before, well, there are no stories that haven't been done before. We've been telling stories for so long that biologists frequently refer to us as the storytelling ape, and describe the evolution of the human species as being fundamentally connected with the telling of stories. It was the telling of stories that is credited with us developing the power of speech and the ability to tell the other apes in our tribe what was going on around us. It went from being ook ook ook, whatever the librarian is saying in Terry Pratchett's works, and if you don't get that reference, then get thee behind me, but ook 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 to tell people where the fruit was, to I think the fruit might come back at this time of year, maybe we should go back to those trees. That's storytelling. It's a capacity that we have that, with the possible exception of the other primates, we haven't identified any other animals that can tell stories in quite the way that we can. Although interestingly, some animals have been shown to be able to lie, which is fantastic and has got to be one of the bases for telling stories in the first place. But it's complicated in that you have the ability as a human to imagine things that aren't happening right now. But there's only so many slots that those stories fit into. Is it a romantic story? Is it a coming of age story? You know, whatever categories you break these down into, all the stories that have ever been told can be put in these categories. And there's a huge amount of academic work on what are the perfect categories to put stories in, how should you define them. And while they don't all agree with each other, I think the thing that they do agree on is that there aren't an infinite number of stories. There are a very, very large number of ways you can combine the words in the English language or any other language to tell a story of the same style, but you're still telling one of the basic story forms. And it's not shameful or bad. It's a good thing. If you were to deviate from the tropes too much, probably what you've done is write something that people won't enjoy. You know, like yeah. I could give some examples of TV that I don't like, but I don't want to upset people. But anyway, so when I say Rick's story plays into the tropes, that's a good thing. But he also plays with the way that we kind of expect the tropes to go. From the very start, I recognise what's happening in this story that he's written. I'm familiar with the way it begins. So the story is about Veratus, who's a court wizard, and he seeks the help of Captain Theron Gerronson, who leads a band of mercenaries. Veratus has a mission from his regent and needs the captain's help to make a return trip through bandit country to complete his mission that he's been assigned by the current regent of their country. So the journey allows Rick to offer glimpses of the world that the characters live in, and the types of people the named characters are, and some of the events in their background that got to this point in the short story. He gets all this done without doing big dollops of exposition. And for anybody who's unfamiliar with the terminology of story, exposition is where you have one of the characters deliver a big speech in which he explains, well, the reason that we have to go and do all this is because X, Y, and Z is true, and therefore we need a young hero to go and do this, and it's because this, and they explain the whole plot. You might find it lampooned with Morgan Freeman doing the voiceover for films, which sometimes is because that's used as a device in films because they're not very good. So they have somebody do a bunch of exposition just to explain what's on screen, because when they come to edit it, they realise this doesn't work at all. People can't understand the story, so we'll just have somebody do a voiceover. Morgan Freeman happens to be probably the best person for doing voiceovers like that for some reason, but I'm sure he's done plenty where it works, but it can be mishandled when you're trying to reveal things. So the rule of thumb that is usually given is show, don't tell. Don't write into your stories, oh yes, this is why this has to be done. Show the characters dealing with what you want to explain, and let the reader infer from that how the world works. You certainly can put an exposition in stories. These are guidelines, not laws, but it will be immediately obvious to most readers if you're spoon feeding them large amounts of information and you want to give them information throughout the book rather than do it as one big chunk at the beginning. You know, your editor is going to point that out to you if you've done it, and they'll probably be rolling their eyes, but be nice to you the first couple of times you do it. What Rick does in this is he manages to get out a lot of detail about this world, or at least what felt in my head like a lot of detail, without actually having it break the flow of the story. It all feels like there's natural conversations going on and people thinking about the world around them. And you know, this is a short story, so to achieve that in a short story, you've got to use very short pieces of text to just provide enough color. There's a great comment that I've seen Patrick Rothfuss make. Somebody complimented him at a convention on one of his fight scenes, and they said, "Oh, it's amazing, and the way the guy does this and the other guy blocks it and does that and does this." And, you know, and this guy describes to him this fight and how fantastically written it was. And Patrick Rothfuss just sort of shrugs and goes, "I didn't write that at all. You wrote that all in your own head. All I did was give you subtle hints to let you write your own sword fight scene in that when you were reading it." And that's excellent storytelling. So you ultimately, it doesn't matter what you put on the page, the reader is still going to have to imagine it in their own head. You say somebody's got red hair, they could be imagining any of the types of red hair out there. So if it's not something you want to pin down, your reader's picture of your characters will definitely be different to yours, and you don't necessarily need to describe everything in detail. If you are writing fantasy and you have orcs in your fantasy, you can describe them, but you don't have to put in detail for fantasy readers these days to know basically what an orc is. Nor do you have to describe a sword. If you say something is a scimitar, everybody over the age of about 8 knows what a scimitar is, especially if they read fantasy. So you use short versions of what you could talk about in order to build pictures in the mind of the reader. And you've got the two-pronged approach. You can either go into heavy detail and describe it so that from your perspective as a writer, the reader probably is thinking about the same thing as you, or you can hint at things and let the reader build their own picture. You take the characters into an interrogation room. You don't need to say any more than that. If they know it's the 1920s, they're picturing a smoky, like run-down room and wooden chairs and stuff. But if they're picturing, the present day, then they're probably thinking there's a steel table. It's probably got clamps built in so they can cuff people to it, and there's a two-way mirror in there and stuff. They know what an interrogation room is, and they'll fill in the detail themselves. So Rick, in his story, manages to get across a whole bunch of things about the world that made me think, oh yeah, I know what's going on there, and I know what the world looks like, and I know where they're going in the world. So I'm filling in probably a whole lot of details that Rick has only had to hint at, and he does that really well. It's great. So they go out on this quest, the wizard and the band of mercenaries, and it's very hard to do this without spoilers. But the completion of the quest isn't the end of the narrative that Rick's telling, and there's a nice twist in the tale which he accomplishes really well, and it gives the extra kick that a short story needs to become complete. You'll find reading, if you read enough short stories, there is a common style that the good short stories tend to have, and that is that there's usually some kind of twist. Is probably an oversimplification, but we'll use that. Usually some kind of surprise twist, fake out in there, or something, because you've got to lend punch to the end of the short story, because you don't have lots of time to build things up and then have you can't have a massive third act of your story as you would do in a novel, or even a novella. Short stories maybe up to, I think, 17,500 words is the. No, hang on, is that wrong? No, maybe not. Maybe maybe a novelette finishes at 17,500 words. But the point is, there are, you can look them up on the Science Fiction Writers of America. They've got a list of how long a short story versus a novelette, novella, and then novel are. And most people just tend to use their word counts these days. But the point is, you don't have a vast amount of space to deal with these things in a short story, so you have to get in and out very quickly in order to meet the constraints of word count, and that is tricky to do, and it means you tend to have fewer characters, you tend to have less detail in description, and you want a punchy ending. You can't have a self-indulgent ending of any kind, or have multiple endings, which, despite what some people say, works extremely well in The Lord of the Rings. And I will fight you over that in every respect, bar the one where we actually have to, you know, punch people, because I'd rather be drinking a gin and tonic or eating something than actually having a fist fight. But you're still wrong if you think The Lord of the Rings multiple endings is bad. So what Rick's done here, you can really picture the epic fantasy world that he's built, and that's in the background of this. And I can certainly imagine reading a trilogy that this story would lead into, or perhaps I could see it as a 20 years earlier, this is what happened, and then this is where the world is now. Yeah, if Rick ever writes that, I would certainly be putting that on my wish list. And I really enjoy the story. I think it's a great way to open an anthology of epic fantasy short stories. And with that, that's all I've got to say about Unchosen by Rick Partlow. I would highly recommend you buy Kingdoms of Iron and Stone. And what I hope to do is try and but talk about the rest of the stories in the anthology over the coming weeks. So you can get it on Amazon, and I think that's about all I have to say about it for the time being. So thank you very much for listening to this, or if you were really brave, watching me on YouTube as I and ah through all this. And I hope to see you next time on Jackanory, or whatever this actually is. Cheers.